Member for Light.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I move the motion in my name. Mr Speaker, in speaking to the motion—
Very well, Member for Light. It's seconded as I understand it. I'll put the question. Those of the opinion say aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mr Clark.
Private Member's Business. Other motions. Notes of motion number 130. The Honourable A. Piccolo to move.
Member for Light.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I stand to move the motion in my name. Mr Speaker, it is with no great joy that I move this motion today, because it reflects the failure of the world governments, and in particular Western nations, to resolve a conflict which has started over 75 years ago. This conflict did not start on the 7th of October this year. To say so is both historically incorrect and offensive to those who have lost their lives and those who mourn and grieve for both family and friends. And in particular, Mr Acting Speaker, those children who will never experience the opportunity to go to school, to play sport or play music, to enter into relationships or have children of their own, all those things that are an expression of our humanity. Most of those lives lost have been innocent civilians, both Israeli and Palestinian. Over those 75 years, many people have lost their lives. It is a senseless conflict that we have to stop pretending that if we turn a blind eye or stay silent, the plight of the Palestinian people in this conflict will be resolved. Mr Acting Speaker, when we stay silent, evil prevails. Evil prevailed on the 7th of October, which resulted in the senseless death of 1,200 Israelis and another 240 abducted. The grief and anger of the Israeli people is understandable, and quite rightly those acts have been condemned. Mr Speaker, since the 7th of October, 14,532 Palestinians, including 6,000 children, have died as a result of Israel's response to the horrific acts of 7th of October. The indiscriminate killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, and particularly children, has caused enormous grief and pain in Palestine, and quite rightly be called an evil act and worthy of condemnation. In my faith, Mr Acting Speaker, we are all born equal in the image of God. No child is less equal, and no child's death should be referred to as collateral damage. There is no justification in killing innocent children, and to refer them as collateral damage is an affront to our humanity. Mr Acting Speaker, my faith teaches me that of the power of love and peace, and the right of all of us to live in dignity and be treated in dignity. That includes the Palestinian people. It is no accident, Mr Acting Speaker, that in 1977 the General Assembly of the United Nations decided at the 91st plenary meeting held on the 2nd of December 1977 to commence an annual observance day on the 29th of November as the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Mr Speaker, this decision was based on a recommendation of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian people, and that's what this motion seeks to do. Acknowledge the right of Palestinian people to self-determination, to live in peace, to prosper, to live freely in a place called Palestine, as determined by international law and with internationally recognised boundaries. Mr Acting Speaker, this motion will not change the course of events in either Canberra or the Middle East. What this motion does, hopefully, Mr Acting Speaker, it sends a message to the Palestinian community of all faiths, Muslim and Arab people of all faiths, in our community, that their grief and pain felt by them at the current conflict in Palestine is acknowledged by this Parliament, and every life lost deserves equal consideration and respect by all of us. By acknowledging their grief and pain, we make a positive contribution to the process of healing. The process of healing would only truly progress when political leaders acknowledge the grief and pain of both communities and not preference one over the other. Our political leaders should not act as cheerleaders for one side or the other in this conflict, but use language which respects both. What is said is important, Mr Acting Speaker, but what is not said is more important. Had the political commentary to date been reasonably balanced and respectful to all communities involved in the current conflict, there would be no need for this motion. The broader Palestinian communities have felt isolated and silenced by the lack of words which recognise their plight and their experience. Mr. Acting Speaker, Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations adopts the principle of equal rights and self-determination. When we talk about international law and when we talk about rules-based behaviour, clearly we have to apply that to all nations and not selectively with some nations and not others. At this point, Mr. Acting Speaker, I would like to acknowledge the steps made by the Albanese Federal Government and Minister Penny Wong to actually acknowledge that, that international humanitarian law applies to this conflict. While I personally think the response by the Federal Government could have been more precise and clearer, I do not criticise them. Because of all the political voices on this matter, theirs have been the most moderate and considered. Some of the political rhetoric has been hypocritical and harmful, as they call for social cohesion and use inflammatory language which creates division. It is also important to note, Mr. Acting Speaker, that earlier this year this chamber endorsed the principles of 1 to 8 stated in the Sydney Statement on anti-Palestinianism. Those principles make it very clear that the rights of Palestinian people and the rights of Palestine nation under international law. There is nothing really controversial about this because what it says is that the international law, and this is what we should be upholding as a world community, Australia is part of that world community, and that these are the principles that we should be upholding, including the rights of Palestinian people to actually protest peacefully around the world in support of their plight and their right to statehood. Sadly, Mr. Acting Speaker, we are in a position where often just criticising the Israeli government makes you anti-Semitic. I reject that position. It is important that we acknowledge that supporting the rights of Palestinian people to statehood does not diminish the right of Jewish people to their own state of Israel. On the 15th of May each year, the Palestinian people around the world commemorate Nakba, the day that 80% of Palestinians live in the land occupied by Israel were forced from their homes and country and made refugees. The remaining 20% became internally displaced people. The petitioning of Palestine without the consent of the Palestinian people was a disastrous decision by the United Nations to appease the Zionist movement and cleanse the conscience of Europe for their failure to stop the barbarism and extreme political right against the Jewish people across the continent. The Palestinian people paid and continue to pay a heavy price for the sins of Western nations to address one injustice by only creating another. Palestinian people continue to be victims of 19th century and 20th century colonialism. From 1947 to 1949, over 530 Palestinian towns and villages were completely destroyed by Zionist militia, with many of them depopulated towns taken over by Jewish settlers and renamed. Around 15,000 Palestinian people were killed during these forced takeovers of Palestinian lands, and almost 800,000 Palestinian people were expelled from their homes in Galilee. Those who attempted to return were shot and killed. Sadly, successive Israeli governments have introduced laws and enacted policies that have made Palestinian people second-class citizens in their own country. The discrimination, hardship and indignities experienced by Palestinian people would not be tolerated in any first world nation in Western Europe. Yet we continue to turn a blind eye to the plight of Palestinian people. Mr. Acting Speaker, many Palestinian people lived scattered across the world, hoping that one day they'll be able to return home, a right that all Australians expect and experience, but one which is denied to the Palestinian people. Today, Mr. Acting Speaker, 6 million Palestinian refugees reside outside historical Palestine and continue to be denied their right to return to their homeland, while the 3.5 million Palestinians who live on the West Bank are denied the right to vote for a government that continues to control every aspect of their lives. Some 2.2 million Palestinians live in appalling conditions caused by the ongoing seizure of their lands by Israeli forces, while 1.9 million Palestinians continue to live within historic Palestine, do not have the right to vote, but are subject to different laws which diminish the inherent humanity and dignity. While many European powers have accepted the process of decolonisation across the world, Israel continues to be permitted to occupy the lands and lives of the Palestinian people. Mr. Acting Speaker, it is right that we remember the Holocaust and other atrocities and acts of genocide committed during the 20th and 21st century. But in doing so, it should not be allowed to justify the aggression and violence against the Palestinian people, nor should we allow ourselves to be distracted from what is happening in Palestine today and be blind to the hardship and oppression experienced by Palestinian people. As the Foreign Minister has quite rightly said, this conflict will not be resolved unless we work towards a plan to recognise the plight of Palestinians to achieve statehood with internationally recognised boundaries. The internationally recognised borders to this day, and by that I mean international law, are the 1967 boundaries, yet those boundaries continue to be breached by the State of Israel. We also do need to acknowledge there is a power imbalance between the Palestinian people and the State of Israel. It is important to note that we as an Australian nation, and that's why this motion calls for the Australian Government to acknowledge the right of Palestinian people to self-determination as provided by international law, acknowledge the Palestinians' right to statehood, and also actively promote measures to end the conflict between Israel and Palestine on just grounds and on basis of international negotiations. It is time for Palestine to be free and for the Palestinian people and Israeli people to live in peace. For this to happen, we need to not only stand by Israel, but stand by the people of Palestine.